Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Goldin, for those who don't know me, and it's a pleasure as the director of the school to introduce myself and Chris, my co-author on Age of Discovery. We're excited because this is the day that we are going public with the book in Oxford. It was actually published last Thursday by Bloomsbury. We had a good party in London. And it's also the day in which it's being published in the US. So it's a special day for us. I'll say something about why we did this book and some of the background to it, framing it, and then Chris will give you a better sense of the contents, and I'll come back with some concluding thoughts about what does this all mean, what are the takeaways from it. So this book really arises through the extraordinary possibilities that the Oxford Martin School offer for us to understand the frontiers of many dimensions of change. The frontiers of medicine, absolutely extraordinary people that we've had access to speak to about what's happening, from neuroscience to genetics. The frontiers of the sciences, physical and biological sciences, what's happening with quantum, what's happening with energy, what's happening in our understanding of the universe. The frontiers of the social sciences, our understanding of how societies are evolving, how inequality is evolving, and drawing on the extraordinary breadth and depth of the humanities. The Oxford Martin School is not as well represented in humanities as we'd like to be. We cover 60 disciplines. Our main humanities discipline is philosophy. But we have been extraordinarily fortunate to be able to speak to people. And one of the wonderful things that happens in Oxford, both over college meals and conversations, and Balliol, my college, is particularly rich in this regard, but more broadly, is this ability to really learn from people that know and understand topics at huge depth. So we begin this project with enormous modesty, because how could we possibly not only cover a huge variety of conceptual areas and disciplines, but also pretend to understand history and the Renaissance. So it's been a voyage of discovery for us as authors, and I've been most fortunate to be able to do this with Chris, who is not only an amazing guy and incredibly smart, but managed to do both his doctorate and co-author this book at the same time. I was very, very nervous that one would suffer, and I was actually particularly nervous the doctorate would suffer because I would not be able to show my face in front of his supervisor, but he got his doctorate a few months ago, so congratulations, Chris, on those two achievements.
Yes, thanks.
The reason we wanted to do this book is because we have been puzzled by something, which is, if we, in such a good time in human history, why do we feel so bad? And that's really at the heart of the motivation for this. What's going on in the world? How do we make sense of the world? How do we gain perspective on our present time? It's a time where all of us, certainly those in the room, have a better chance of living longer, healthier lives than any generation that's gone before us. It's a time when you look at the macro statistics, as I've done in my many previous books, about what's happening in development, what's happening in economies around the world, what's happening in societies around. One can't help but being absolutely amazed by this extraordinary time we live in. The most precious time in human history to be alive. For more people, more possibilities than ever in human history. Just over the last 40 years or so, average life expectancy in the world's increased by 20 years. It took from the Stone Age to the 1970s to achieve that. The number of people living in desperate poverty has gone down by about 300 million, even though the world's population's increased by 2 billion. That's never happened before, when you've got very large increases in population and very rapid declines in poverty. And crucially, the number of illiterate people has gone down from about 60% of the world's population of 5 billion to under 1 billion out of the world's population of 7.3 billion today. Amazing things in our lifetimes. And when we look across the labs in Oxford and elsewhere, we're even more excited about the possibilities. And yet, when you look at how people feel, you see rising anxiety, growing concerns, and many who want to turn their back on modernity. Many who want to turn their back on the drivers that have brought us this progress, which is integration of societies, walls coming down everywhere, ideas flowing more freely, and massive technological leaps, which mean that we, for the first time since our forefathers left Africa 230,000 years ago or so, have really come to understand ourselves as a common humanity. If you look at Brexit, Trump, Saunders, Corbyn, Marine Le Pen, the close victory of the far right in Austria, success by the Greens, President Duterte, who's just been elected president of the Philippines. In country after country, people are deserting the center and moving to extremes. And of course, the real extremes are ISIS, jihadists, and others. And people are challenging authority and losing confidence in authority in ways which we see swelling to mass movements and turning their back on integration, wanting to try and withdraw. So we have this paradox: when we've never done so better out of integration, we want to be more insular. And this is extremely dangerous because it means we are even less capable in managing change. Because we believe that the future lies in interdependency. The future lies in benefiting from what's going on around the world and trying to shape the future by joining up with others, by coordinating responses, whether it's to climate change, to pandemics, to cyber attacks, to financial crises, or to inequality. And so the book is really written with this perspective. Let me say finally why the Renaissance frame. When you think about today, this is the slowest day you will know for the rest of your lives. That's the engine of change that's happening around the world. And in periods of tumultuous change, people feel out of control. They feel like these changes might be bringing goods, but they are bringing extraordinary dangers as well. And we were trying to think about what can we learn, where else, what other periods in history have experienced these sorts of changes. We were drawn to the Renaissance because we believe, as Chris will describe, that it's a period of tumultuous changes which, in many respects, have lessons for the present time. Now, we learned from our many conversations with great historians in Oxford that this is a very dangerous enterprise. There were some historians which told us the Renaissance never existed. There were others that, of course, that told us our periodization was completely wrong. The causes that we attributed to it and the effects were wrong. And that anyway, one can't learn from history. That's not the purpose of history. So we realized that this is dangerous to do this sort of thing. But we think it's useful. We found it useful for ourselves in framing the present and trying to frame perspective. So we offer it. We're not suggesting for a minute that it's the only historical period to look back onto. We encourage others to look at other periods that they might find at least as useful. And we're certainly not suggesting that history repeats itself. We're suggesting that the technological leaps that were facilitated by the Gutenberg press, by information exchanges, were central to a flourishing of society. But that the accelerating pace of change led to extremism, and that the Renaissance effectively was destroyed by itself and its inability to cope with change. And unless we heed these lessons, we might find that this most extraordinary moment we're in doesn't get thought back on in 500 years' time as a period of new renaissance, which we believe it is, but rather as a time when humanity lost its way and didn't seize the opportunities that it had. So that's the purpose of the book. Chris will tell you a bit about it.
Well, thanks for leaving the hard part for me, Ian. Maybe just begin by saying that this is a popular book. It's not an academic book. And so a lot of what we've been doing the past little while is sort of telling the very quick story, the elevator pitches. We were on conservative talk radio this morning in the US, which was a very interesting experience. But what we thought we'd like to do, here in Oxford, in the Oxford Martin School, is just get a bit beneath the hype, spend a bit more time just talking about the ideas behind the book and why we think it's helpful and important. So let me begin by just sharing a couple of my thoughts on why this book, why we wrote Age of Discovery. And I think a big reason for both of us is the sense that we need a good framework to make sense of the present. That rapid change has kind of ruined our expectations, that if we're honest with ourselves, we're not bad, our batting average is pretty low right now in terms of predicting the big things that are going to dominate our awareness and our conversation. Economic shocks, going back to the financial crisis, which is, believe it or not, when we started talking about writing this book back in 2010. We've been at this one for a while. Collapsing commodity and oil prices, and also social shocks, Trumpism, Brexit, the kind of populist, extremist political movements that Ian talked about. And just having a general sense that a time of rapid change, plus not having a good way of making sense of surprise, is a bad idea, is a dangerous thing. Because if we don't have a good way of making sense of things when they happen, we're more likely to hesitate instead of act. And when change is rapid, it's also likely that our response needs to be rapid as well. But also because when reality leaves us gasping for the big picture is when we're often likely to latch on to the wrong one for the wrong reasons. And we can reflect and see evidence of that kind of stuff today. And also, I think, not just an intellectual concern, but frankly also personal concern that we have about sort of going through this moment without a framework for making sense of things. Ian, I'll let him speak for himself, but was working for so much time about trying to make the idea of globalization work on a practical level for all of us, and just how difficult it must be to see the pessimism and the division threatening that optimistic vision of what this is all meant to be about, our opening and connecting up to one another. And for me too, actually, so talk about falling commodity prices. I became unemployed in January because the Canadian company I was working for was completely wrecked by the collapse in oil prices. So I experienced firsthand how we hesitate when things happen that we just didn't expect, and how when they do, we can get angry and upset. And I had done everything right. I was doing what was expected of me. That didn't change the fact that events completely outside of my control had a very real impact on my life. And so I think realizing in moments like that yes, we want to be able to step back, take a deep breath, and just feel that we make sense of it somehow. And so why Age of Discovery? For me, I feel like there were three general reasons The first is the word discovery itself, that it's both, the connotations can be both positive and threatening. Positive because discovery is about finding new lands and new resources and new ideas and technologies. The negative, that it's also about finding new vulnerabilities, new interdependencies with each other and unintended negative consequences. Actually, second and third, I'm not going to get into. Why, I guess the other reason why the age of the discovery, sort of the historical argument that Ian kindly suggested I would elaborate on, I guess we had sort of three thoughts there, that it's sort of, or maybe two, that in a big general way, the mega trends that shaped the early modern Europe in the 15th and 16th century are kind of feel similar to the trends shaping today. New maps, maybe the first one. The voyages of discovery of Columbus, da Gama, Magellan. They took what was the known world and doubled it. And what before the voyages of discovery had been known, it turned out was less than half of the whole. And they put the world's precious resources into global motion for the first time. Today, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, China's emergence from autarky, the spread of market economics around the world to the point where today really only North Korea can consider itself somewhat unplugged from global economic systems, means that if you take political or economic maps of the world from 1985, they're totally useless today. We've completely changed the maps that we use to understand the world. And that was true then and now. The second is obviously new media, the Gutenberg press, the internet. I don't want to, it's an analogy we all know, so I won't go into it. But clearly, it changed, it freed information, it amplified information, it standardized communication, it gave people a reason to learn to read then and now, and it empowered people to reach a broad audience. And then the third is a step change in development, which Ian talked about. When you look at the big macro statistics, in an aggregate sense, today is the best time to be alive. We have real issues with the distribution, and we get that. But a child born pretty much anywhere today can expect to be healthier, wealthier, and live longer, and have a better education. In the last Renaissance, the petering out of the Black Death was really important in delivering to Europe a younger, healthier population, a demand for labor that led to a recovery in people's material well-being. And you put those together, you had a set of consequences, twin consequences that we feel not only marked that historical period, but also today. A positive consequence being, of course, the flourishing of genius, which sort of in popular mythology of the Renaissance is what we all think about, probably when we first hear the word. Copernican revolutions in art. But if you look at Europe in 1450, it was behind most other civilizations on Earth in terms of its technologies, its economy, its energy, its trade, and by 1550 had leapfrogged them. So something dramatic changed in Europe. And similarly today, we've had a dramatic just flourishing of our economic connectedness, but also our technologies. Sorry, I'm jumping around a bit. The other side is that, of course, it was ugly. It wasn't a time of only flourishing positive consequences, but negative as well. So Copernicus upended God-given notions of heaven and earth, and there was a lot of resistance and reaction to that. The voyages of discovery generated trade riches for some, but it also spread conflict, economic collapse, and pandemics to many others in the Americas and in Europe. The Gutenberg printing press put scribes out of business and it enabled Martin Luther to ignite a century of religious wars. Gunpowder shocked the once invulnerable. Ottoman cannons toppled Europe's eastern bulwark, Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul, and they shoved Venice's mighty merchant fleet out of the eastern Mediterranean. There's a kind of similar naivety, we thought, in our popular imagination of globalization, sort of comparing how we think of the Renaissance and how in the 1990s we thought about, or some of us thought about globalization. Sort of there was this naive idea that walls are bad, and when they come down, the benefits trickle to everyone. And of course, now we know, and I think especially in the last few years, we've forced one another to recognize that walls also hold up roofs. Walls are not simply a negative thing. And when we take them down, the benefits don't just trickle evenly to everyone, they pool into those hands and into those places that have some advantage along the remaining dimensions of difference. So we've become disillusioned. Sort of, we've given up the fantasy, and we've come to appreciate a far more complex and nuanced reality of the costs and benefits of our entanglement with one another. And that's the exact same thing, or that's I think the key historical parallel that we want to draw to the Renaissance and the story that we tell through the book, is that when you actually examine what were the consequences of the discovery of the Americas, what were the consequences of the Gutenberg press, we recognize that as today, they were two-sided. There were winners and there were losers. And I guess, as a consequence, sort of thinking of the present as a second Renaissance, I think helps us to understand the anxieties that are sweeping the world today. So just thinking, just briefly, so Martin Luther, for example, 1519, I guess just about 500th anniversary. Here's someone who's just a monk, a friar actually, who felt that the establishment had strayed from its spiritual mandate, that it and its theology had become corrupt. And so he said something about it. He's like, I don't think that the sale of indulgences is right. And by the way, that's just the first in a long list of things that I think are really wrong with how the establishment, the Catholic Church, is running this show, is taking care of our spiritual well-being. And that discontent, conveyed through the network of print, united a coalition that, for many reasons, some of them shared his theology, some of them saw it as a good opportunity to seize power from the local church, but they united around that idea that they were no longer content to live under the Catholic establishment. And what were the consequences of that? A Protestant Reformation, a century of religious wars in Europe, the largest migration of peoples that Europe had seen since the fall of the Roman Empire and would see again until the First World War. And so what is underway today in the US, the popularity of Trump and Sanders, in the UK, the very real possibility that people vote, a majority votes for Brexit, the power of extreme political agendas across Europe. I think if we're honest with ourselves, it took all of us by surprise. But maybe it shouldn't have. Right? And I think one of the things that we learn from history is to be able to imagine more possibilities about what might happen, what in these sort of circumstances could possibly come to pass. I think history, when we look back, and we find a good analogy for the moment we're in, it helps to fire and stretch our imagination, right? That these are also responses and reactions that people can have. It was actually Machiavelli who wrote in 1517 that those who want to foresee the future need to understand the past, because we're all animated by the same passions. And his point was that technologies can change and circumstances can differ, but the human character, human nature is a more stable thing, right? And so we can look at how we've dealt with stresses in the past and get some ideas of how we might deal with them going forward. So things like Trumpism and Brexit, I guess, if we had looked at all these things through the lens of this is a second Renaissance, we'd expect it, and we'd take it very seriously, because just because we can't imagine it doesn't mean it can't happen. The fault could be with our own imagination, and what we need to do is look to the past and find inspiration to see new futures. And maybe with that, let me turn it back to Ian and just talk a bit about, in a more down-to-earth practical sense, what we think some of the takeaways were from the last Renaissance.
Great, Chris. So you have some sense of it, and this is quite a long book with a lot of depth in it, and Chris has given you a flavor. But we go into considerable detail on examples of the pace of innovation then and the pace of innovation now. And how, in that time, a lot of the innovation wasn't recognized, often for hundreds of years. At other times, it had a very quick impact, like the Gutenberg press, of course. And so the first of our broad takeaways is how one operates in a world where there's just a lot more information, where what we call genius, by which we really just mean exceptional, unusual talent, flowering and not being recognized. It might have been there before, but it gets voice, it gets amplified, it gets heard in societies. And how both individual genius, which is sort of just the random distribution of people's capabilities, being allowed to express themselves because they're literate, because they're connected, because they have a printing press or a social media page, but also collective genius, which is a more interesting concept in a way that we talk about, which is when people come together with diverse views from different disciplines and different cultures and nations, they actually invent more rapidly. And one of the big debates, that's the background to this book, is whether innovation is slowing down or speeding up, which we engaged in and believe firmly it's speeding up. But it's both because there's just more individual creativity and because there's more collective diversity, because more people are bouncing off. And whether they're the labs in Oxford working on new cures for cancer, new energy forms, or academics in other areas, or artists, or any sphere, people now are thriving in a 24-hour intellectual community, which is totally global, and therefore able to do things they would never conceivably have done before. And that's what happened in the Renaissance too, with people like Erasmus and others, bringing people together, places like Florence, and becoming the hives in which these communities from different places, different disciplines, were able to interact and do things they could never have done if they had been in a prior world. So we think we will see much more rapid change, and we think we're going to have to get much better at understanding this change, what we call welcoming genius. And it's partly about listening to the scientists and what people at the forefront are saying. Now, one of the things we find very puzzling is things like climate change deniers. People who just don't understand that our knowledge base has leapt ahead. And so catching up with the frontiers, understanding what people are saying about machine intelligence, understanding what people are saying about DNA and the consequences of the abilities to sequence at that level. Or our new understanding of the irrationalities of some of our collective actions, like if we all take antibiotics, ineffectively we get antibiotic resistance. Understanding these things more quickly becomes a greater responsibility for all of us. And of course, it's important, not least for politicians, that they understand what the new realities are. The second takeaway is around this issue which Chris has touched on, of the uneven distribution of the benefits and gains in times of change. The more rapidly we change, the greater the onus on those that are able to change is to bring others along with them. And one of the great failures of globalization in recent decades has been that those that have been able to be at the frontier, those that have been able to have the skills or be in a big city like London or New York or another thriving place, or those that have had broadband connectivity and agility in their ability to change jobs and skills and things, have done fabulously well. And of course, this has been particularly true of capital, of businesses which are global, which are able to play global marketplaces. But those that are stuck in the past have fallen further and further behind. And whether they're in a town with a declining industry with no jobs and they can't afford to go and move to London and the transport infrastructure doesn't allow them to commute there, or whether they're in a country which has been insulated from the gains of globalization by corrupt leaders, or they're illiterate, or they are just stuck because they're too old to change, or they can't change because they have dependents that are holding them where they are. People are falling further and further behind. And so the responsibilities that on those that do well in this period are great if they want to sustain the momentum for this period of change. Because if enough people feel that this is a threat, not an opportunity, you get extremism. If enough people feel that it's a corrupt leadership or authorities that are benefiting, but not them, that this is a great myth, this period of do good and do well, then you get very severe fractioning of society. So we're in an entangled world, a world which is not just connected, because connectivity implies choice. It implies that you can disconnect, somehow turn it off. We're in an entangled world. We have no choices. Those that are with us, which is the whole global community, increasingly will affect our lives. And so what we do increasingly affects the future of the planet and each other. This entanglement is a new dimension as well of this age. It was, we believe, echoed, or comes from an echo of this previous period of entanglement. Both the foreseen and unforeseen consequences of it. Voyages of discovery going off to the Americas and by accident killing most Native Americans. That was an accident. They didn't intend to do it. They did intend to kill some of them, but not all of them. And those things are happening at growing speed. So understanding our responsibilities, paying tax, building social safety nets, understanding that the sum of our individual actions and individual freedom does not mean the dereliction of collective responsibilities. That this tension between the growth of freedoms and the power we all have to say what we want, when we want, how we want, and our collective responsibility to look after others becomes more and more acute because we are in this entangled world. Another lesson from this period is, of course, that we don't understand it. That the smartest institutions like the IMF and our central banks, with high-paid salaries and lots of data, have proved themselves spectacularly inadequate. It's no accident that the best system, that is finance, the most data-intensive and powerful, was associated with the first systemic collapse of this new renaissance. And it's because we are obsessed with the data and blinded by the blizzard of it, rather than relying on intuition, judgment, wisdom, the things that we believe in the end came out of what the Renaissance was teaching people. Often harking back to ancient Greece, for example, in it picking up its echoes. So these are not new ideas. Now, because of the tax systems and because of risk aversity, there's a great desire of people not to take risk, a risk aversion. Businesses in the US are sitting on $1.7 trillion of cash at the moment. Just the top 6 companies are sitting on over $500 billion in cash. An aversion to investment because it's more effective for them to just keep this in cash at the moment. Now, this sort of behavior, we believe, is extremely negative and one of the reasons why we're in a stagnating global economy. In a globalized world, in a rapidly changing world, the world is not flat, as a friend wrote. The world is more and more uneven. The mountains of success and the valleys of poverty are greater. Inequality is growing in all countries in the world, and that is because we are more integrated, and it is because the pace of change is greater, because those that are ahead are racing ahead. What does this mean? It means place actually matters more than ever. Because if you're in the right place where the jobs are, you're okay. Or in the right country without a corrupt leadership which is trying to manage globalization effectively. But if you're not, you're left behind. And so this paradox of the information age and place is one we talk a lot about. How does one get to the right place? How does one know what the right place is, and how does one break into it? But it also speaks to this question of immigration very strongly. Because if you're not at the right place, you need to get there. That's where the jobs are. That's where the future is. It won't come to you. You go to it as much as it's coming to you. And that's certainly, of course, the case if you're unfortunate enough to be in Aleppo or Baghdad at the moment, or many other places. So immigration is central, and we believe that we can't have a coherent response to growing inequality without addressing immigration as one element, our responsibilities, and creating more effective social safety nets, which means more tax for the rich, which means that those that are benefiting so fabulously, if they want to sustain the system, have to be more inclusive. They have to be prepared to mend our social fabric, which is being torn apart. So it's a strong agenda. It's an agenda which doesn't say, as we were asked on this conservative talk show today, is it all hopeless? No. This is a renaissance. And we wanted the Renaissance analogy because we think about the Renaissance as a most remarkable flowering, and it was. But we want people also to think about some of the other dimensions of it. And we want them to think about whether we are able to cope with change and whether we can learn lessons from that period, and not have the reflex of fear and withdrawal and believe that somehow if we put up the walls and become more protectionist and more xenophobic, we will better manage the future. Because the exact opposite is the case. When you're in a world where all the key drivers, or most of the key drivers of change, are coming from somewhere else, be it climate change, or pandemics, or cyber attacks, or financial, as well as the opportunities, the new jobs, the new technologies, the things that will lead us to have longer, healthier lives. When these are coming from somewhere else, the choice is, do we join up with that? Do we try and shape it? Do we affect it? Or do we withdraw? And so we are convinced that the strategy, which many want to adopt, which is to withdraw and build higher walls, is extremely counterproductive. The final thing we talk about in the book is what makes us able to gain better perspective in terms of more rounded, interdisciplinary. And here we really do think that the way that many of those in the Renaissance felt about art, about poetry, about music, and of course Shakespeare writing slightly later about Thomas More's imagined conversation trying to convince people not to kill the refugees. These resonance resonances from the past were built on an understanding of the need to use multiple dimensions to understand. And certainly Shakespeare was doing that as we celebrate him. So this is a contest. This is a contest for the future. It's a contest of ideas. It's a contest in our ability to advance our understanding of each other, of our common humanity, more rapidly than those centrifugal forces that would tear us apart. And whether we win this contest or not will determine whether this is the best century in humanity's history or the worst. This book not only owes to Chris and my collaboration, but also to many others, and it's wonderful looking around the room, seeing at one time we had something like 8 research assistants working on the book because we needed someone who really understood quantum. We needed someone that really understood DNA, that really understood various aspects of Renaissance. And it's lovely to see you here, and we thank you, the professors that are here that have helped us, all our friends and family who've made this possible. We hope you enjoy it. We do Q&A now, and then we will have a book signing for this book and also The Pursuit of Development, which is the one I talked about last week, which is sort of related to this as well. So we've got about maximum 45 minutes, and then you can all be rewarded with a drink. Who'd like to go first? Yeah, hand at the back. Smart, yeah.
Okay, you seem to be characterising Brexit as a case of pushing up the walls, and it just seems to be quite a polemical approach, and certainly not the only way to see it, because as you also observed, there's a whole world out there. And I've always thought Europe's a bit of a rich boys club, so I'm just surprised by that. It seems a bit like loose talk.
Okay, well, I mean, this is, you know, Chris can just hit me if I go on too long on this one, because it's something which I'm passionate about. It actually just came from a debate yesterday on this. I think the question I'd ask, if you care about the future of British citizens, which is, I presume, the perspective you're coming from rather than the rest of the world, let's say we care about the future of British citizens, and we want to ask ourselves the question, will British citizens' futures be better safeguarded by being in or out of Europe? Now, let's think about the 5 or 6 top things which will affect the future of Britain. Okay, we start with jobs and economics. And all I would say is that there's not a single authoritative body in the UK or anywhere in the world that's made an argument that Brexit would leave British people better off. Not a single one. From the Bank of England to the Treasury, to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the OECD, to all the think tanks which have any standing in economics, there hasn't been one. The only people that think that British people will be better off out of Europe in terms of economics are very strange bedfellows, like Marine Le Pen and Putin and Trump. So I won't, and I'm an economist, I could go into detail, but let's just leave the economic arguments aside and say there's no credible reason to make for the UK. But that's not what interests me in terms of this question. What interests me is 2 things. What is Europe's place going to be in the world in solving these issues that we've been talking about? Climate change, pandemic, cyber attacks, whatever you want to list. Would Europe be stronger with or without the UK in? And I think I've never heard anyone make an argument that Europe would be stronger without the UK. So let's assume Europe will be a stronger global force. It's going to be one of 3 global forces going forward that's really going to drive change. India and China, one sort of constellation, North America and Europe. The UK will be a tiny, tiny bit middle-level player on its own. And then you ask yourself the question never mind Europe, let's talk about the UK. Let's think about the future of the UK and its ability to manage a pandemic or climate change or jobs and machine intelligence or markets. I haven't ever heard anyone say that the UK will be stronger. I mean, I've heard people say it. I heard Gove say it in a debate that I was at yesterday, but there's no evidence for his position. What is remarkable is that Europe is the most advanced region in the world on climate change. That, in large part, is due to the UK's role within Europe, for example. There were many other good people in Europe, but the UK plays a very good part. So I just struggle to think of a world in which the UK's future would be better placed by being out. And Obama said it very clearly as well when he was here a few weeks ago. The US certainly believes the world would be a scarier place with the UK out of Europe.
Which is not the same as saying that the EU is working as well as it should.
No, of course
Right,
not.
and I
No,
think
no, the EU, that's why we need to be there to help fix it.
Exactly.
Okay, we're working our way to the front. Yep.
How far would you say that you're an optimist or a pessimist?
You go first, Chris.
The shades of the conservative talk radio show that we were on this morning. And he very much portrayed it in sort of black and white terms. You know, is the 21st century going to be our descent into hell, or is it going to be something much better than that? And I mean, I think that my view on this, and I'll let Ian speak for himself, but this question, I think, comes to the real heart of why I wanted to write this book, because I really do believe it's up to us. I don't actually think it's a matter of, you know, there are these mega trends underway that are inevitably going to make everything turn out better. I think that there are these trends underway which are equally tests of human character. And this goes back to sort of when I was talking earlier about globalization, which has always been this very contested term. But I think that sort of the prevailing public idea of the term has kind of evolved over time. You know, in the 1990s, it was generally seen as sort of a positive thing, right? That these walls falling down was going to be a good thing. And I think what we've realized is that, yeah, it wasn't just a trend. You know, globalization is not just a trend. It's also a test of human character. You know, as we reduce barriers to one another, we introduce interdependencies. You know, we introduce vulnerabilities. We introduce new terms along which people are going to be winners. Some people who are able to take advantage of this environment, and some people are going to be losers. And then the test is, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to try to shape outcomes so that, you know, the aggregate gains that you know, humanity is making overall are spread widely? Or are we going to let these outcomes shape us and ultimately break us as frustration mounts? And I guess some could argue that we've more been doing the latter. And so I think what we're really trying to do with this book is say, well, you know, we need to recognize that we have important agency here, and that we are not just vulnerable, but we are also powerful. And that if we want to have a more positive 21st century, then we need to make it happen. We can't just expect that it's a consequence of the larger forces underway.
So you're just posing the challenge, you're not coming down on the optimistic or the pessimistic side?
Well, I'm working hard. I wrote a book, and that was a lot of work. And you know, personally, it's gutsy. I feel like it's an irresponsible, gutsy thing to write a book. You know, several years of work while I'm doing a PhD. Nobody pays you to sit down and try to work on these things that you hope are going to have a positive impact. And so now we're trying to get that message out. So this is the first thing that I'm trying to do. And the next thing is, yeah, what is the next thing we can do to work on this? So I'm trying to make it happen. I think we all need to make it happen.
So that's optimism.
Yeah, I mean, let me just sort of give my view. I think it is a bit a case of optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect at times. But you know, you can point to 1,000 reasons to be optimistic, and the Oxford Modern School is an incredibly optimistic place. But I've seen things in my lifetime, you know, that have touched me in millions of ways, which of course was democracy in South Africa is one of them. Corruption in South Africa is not now one of them. So what happens? One can point to the aggregate statistics and what's happening and feel good, but then you look at the whole climate change and all the other unintended consequences. And in part, the outcome, and this goes, so I'm very much with Chris, that's the reason we wrote this book, to try and help increase the balance of possibility. It's really, there's no technical reason why one shouldn't be optimistic. It's all about politics in the end. Do we believe that we have the capabilities to manage ourselves as individual nations and as collective? And just to go back to the Europe question, one of the extraordinary things about Europe, it's the first experiment we've seen of countries willingly giving up power. And one of the reasons it's such an extraordinarily important question about the future of Europe is it's partly about how is the world going to work in the future. Are we still in a Westphalian world where we only have nation states, and how much are we prepared to give up to shared ownership of the planet and shared management of crucial issues? So it's sort of very strategic time. And depending on where you are in that constellation, I believe your balance of optimism or pessimism will be framed. Yeah, I should say, and there's a whole lot of hands, what I omitted to, which I do normally say, is this is being live recorded, maybe even webcast. So if you don't want to be on the web, don't say anything. And if any of you that have already spoken feel that you would, if you'd had known that you wouldn't have spoken, tell me afterwards and we'll cut it out of the YouTube. But if it's live, you're too late. The one behind you, then we'll go there, and then we'll go back.
Oh, thank you. We've argued before, Ian, so you won't be surprised to hear me say that actually everything I thought you said was supposed to be on the side of optimism, and that you were really rather playing down the pessimism. The most interesting thing that I would agree with you that you said was that the rich must pay more taxes. But I mean, these have got to be huge taxes. I mean, I think what people are afraid of is that this world is now run by the corporations, and that people are not empowered, that the corporations have all the money and they're supported by the IMF, the World Bank, the big country governments, and that this is that actually we are hastening to a rather awful end, which is the big frontier, is the frontiers of our planet, yes, which you haven't talked about. You don't seem to realise that there are ecological limits, and that actually this is a small planet that cannot take the sort of change that you're talking about. And I'd like to hear you to talk about much more about that, because that is the big wall against us. And sorry, just one more thing about the immigrants. You say, oh, they must go where they want to go. I mean, you're suggesting we leave the whole of Africa depopulated because they all want to come and live in Europe. I mean, there's a lot more work needs to be done. And just one more thing. There are a lot of people who are trying to make a different framework from the one you've got, which is that actually what we need is degrowth, we need a steady state economy, we need to stop exploiting the planet and stop exploiting a lot of the people on the planet. So what have you got to say?
Well, you always provoke me to think again, which is good. I think,
You addressed the question.
No, I'm going to answer it, but the difference between Chris and I is that I can point to my 19 previous books, which address these questions, and you can't address all questions in every book. We went probably very wider than I've ever gone in this book, but leave out some things. And a previous book, which I've done, is called Is the Planet Full? Which brings a lot of great people together to ask precisely that question. And there's long passages in the book which discuss these questions of Earth limits of various forms, whether we've exceeded them, what we can do, and whether it's a problem of numbers or it's a problem of consumption. And I have pretty strong views about that, but this wasn't the time to address them. Immigration, I don't believe that free borders are the answer, actually. I've never said that, and in my book, Exceptional People, I discuss in detail immigration. But I also don't believe you're right in assuming the whole of Africa would move to Europe. Why would they want to do that? They are not trying very hard at the present. Actually, what's remarkable about the story of immigration is how few people immigrate. The Europe, again, is the best experiment we have data on this, because you can move if you want. If you're one of the 60% unemployed in the south of Spain, youth, you could be here within a few days. Nothing stopping you. When did you guys last meet a Greek or Spanish beggar on the streets of Oxford? I haven't met one, and that's because people who are unemployed stay at home. And particularly people that are desperately poor stay at home because that's the only place they're going to survive. And that's where their family networks are going to support them, etc. They might send one member of the family to try and go overseas to send them back remittances, but there's absolutely no evidence of mass migration unless people face famine, war, or disaster. And that's why a third of Ireland migrated, a third of Sweden migrated, a third of Italy migrated. And none of us would be here if our forefathers hadn't migrated. There's not a person in the room that is not some way back in their history the result of a movement often away from disaster. So the idea that this is either new or African problem or anything else is just totally ahistorical. It's an African problem in the sense that we all came out of Africa. I think the geneticists are pretty convinced about that. There's a sort of war between the South Africans and the East Africans as to where precisely, but that's about the only evidence we have. We populated the world, and I'm not saying we need mass migration. I'm saying we need more managed migration, but bigger numbers. Okay.
I just noticed that you had a quote from Richard Branson on the poster. Is that because he's an example of an individual who's bringing about the Renaissance?
Richard's, the reason really that he's on the poster is because he's a friend, I suppose. But Richard's a remarkable person. He, in some respects, is absolutely at the forefront. Has always been since he was a student dropout of change. Has done extraordinarily good things in many dimensions, including trying to reform businesses. But of course, like all of us, is a bundle of contradictions. He runs an airline which creates a lot of carbon emissions. Not runs, it's his brand. He runs trains which create carbon emissions. He's located in the BVI. There's various things one can look at. All I would say is that he's a great amplifier of many good things. And what we wanted to do with the book is show that this book is a book which would be interesting and appeal to a very, very wide audience. We weren't trying to speak to the choir. So we wanted people who were respected business leaders, of which he certainly is, one of the foremost in the world, and have different audiences. So you'll see if you look at the blurbs we got on the back of the book, people that might surprise you, ranging from people who I regard as my real, the gurus I want, like Nobel Prize in economics. That's great for me. But other people who, so I'm glad we've got both Richard and Kumi Naidu, the head of Greenpeace, saying this is a book worth reading. To me, that's what we want to, if we've achieved that, I feel very good, because it's going to appeal to a wide audience. Yep.
So I thought the gist of your argument, it seems to be that the Renaissance was kind of a great flowering that led to many positive consequences around the world, but also one that sort of ran out of control and resulted in problems, vulnerabilities, sectarian violence, and so on. Given that, isn't it sort of the wisest course of action as responsible citizens to try and slow the pace to one that we can manage, to try and introduce redundancy into the system, to try and slow it to the point where we can integrate the society that's to come with the society that we have now?
Do you want to start on that, Chris?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that a lot of the ideas that you mentioned there, for example, redundancy, I think absolutely. I mean, one of the real risks, I think, that has emerged over the last several years is what we call sort of concentration risks. So everybody starts to feel that there's one right way of doing things. There's one optimal place to put our production systems. So there's one management methodology that seems to work best, one best way of running a university. And so we develop monocultures, right, in our thinking, in our economic systems, in our social systems. And in a time of rapid change, monocultures are a dangerous way to go, right? You need to have the humility to believe that something that we all depend on could not be there for us one day as a consequence of some shock that we didn't see coming. And so redundancies is, a very important way of insulating ourselves against that species of risk. Butterfly defects, another one of your former.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, plugging for one of your previous books is exactly that. I think there's a deeper question about slowing down. And I guess what we'd really have to do, and this might not be the place to do it, but interrogate that a bit more. Slowing what down? Because in some areas, that's probably right. In other areas, it's probably not. One of the consequences of rapid change is that our models for thinking about things, for how we behave, can very quickly become invalid and outdated. And that's one of the reasons that, as Ian said earlier, one of the really important lessons from the last Renaissance is we need to have a certain audacity, a certain boldness, if for no other reason than bold action is what shocks us and other people out of habits of action that are no longer appropriate to a changing world. So stasis is also very dangerous because the world around us continues to change. Ian, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's right. It does depend on what you're talking about changing, and that's why understanding technological change and understanding social change is the first thing you've got to do to understand how these things are right. I don't think people have caught up with both some of the social changes like growing inequality around the world, for example, how people are being trapped and isolated in poverty. You want to understand Trump, you need to understand that the bottom 5% of the population in the US have less chance of escaping poverty or Saunders, than their parents did. And that data is important to understand why people feel the way they do. They want change, they just want change that's going to benefit them. The jobs that have come to them, not go away from them. The second thing I'd say, which is sort of a slightly different point, which is the point that I focus on in part in the butterfly defect, is how do you build integrated systems which aren't hyper contagious or don't lead to cascading shock? And that a lot of that is about short run and long run. So the whole market system is driving towards short-term decision making. And selfish individual decision making, whether it's our decisions to eat sushi, tuna sushi, or whether it is a market's decision to reward a CEO with a quick fix because they've got a quick return. We are moving to shorter and shorter term focus. And this, by the way, is the subject of the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations, which we drew on a lot in this process. And the same is happening at the political level, more and more short-termism. And that's driven by a whole lot of things, including the media cycle and the money cycle that goes around politics, not least in the US. When you're in a short-term environment, you actually don't care too much about things, but it's dramatic. So whether you're the Radcliffe Hospital and you're thinking about what is the stockpile of oxygen bottles or bandages or food, and how interdependent are they on an extraordinarily complex web of supplies every hour, or the mini factory up the road not far away. These hyper-interdependent systems create very great vulnerabilities where very small shocks can lead to very rapid amplifying collapses. And so thinking about system vulnerability and thinking about redundancy in firms as well, one of the big conversations is about concentration risk. If everyone's located in a head office building, for example, or in a place, what do you do if you have a pandemic, or Hurricane Sandy, that's a bit bigger, or a cyber outage of that place? So we are much more vulnerable, and paradoxically, and this goes back to this question about is the world flat or not? Because we are concentrating more, and we're more and more interdependent. So when the tsunami happens, or a Thai flood happens, or anything, Hurricane Sandy happens, or an Icelandic volcano happens, we feel it then immediately. That's new. And so building the system, now that sort of how you do that is the subject of the butterfly defect, but you're absolutely right. I think saying let's stop change, which is obviously some of the things that are being said in the current political debates by both the right and the left, I think can be very dangerous, because actually what you want to do for many people is bring them more rapid change, like life expectancy improvements, for example, and the technologies that come with that. But it's a very important and complex question. Yep.
On this question of winners and losers, I think it's equally applied to America or the UK. There are regions in the UK where the old industrial areas, whose job is it to do something about that? Because, for example, they can't move down here because they can't afford the houses. And you know, you mentioned someone from Spain. Well, they can't come here because they could not afford to live in Oxford. But, I mean, whose job is it to try and rectify that?
I think it's all of our job. I think it's our system's job. In other words, it's the government's job. In other words, it's us as taxpayers' job. Those are decisions about how much social housing you have, how much infrastructure you have, what you do about house prices, and how you control them or don't control them. Obviously, what you do about diversification of job opportunities to other places, how internationalist you are in your views as to whether a job in the UK is more important than a job somewhere else. Those are all very important national debates, but they're also global debates, because it's also about fair standards. Do we care if a job goes somewhere else? Well, it depends. It depends. We don't want some child labourer doing something, or someone who's exploited in another place. But if they're fairly paid in their society, do we feel better about it? That's about common rules and standards and norms. But I believe that's not the role of anyone other than businesses and governments. And we decide on that. I mean, in the end, we constitute our governments in democracies. Another question in autocracies.
I think I'd agree with that, and it goes back to the general point about, you know, we have the naivety of the idea of the Renaissance, that it sounds like it was a golden age, which is also, I think, why, for historians, it's an unpopular term, because simply the connotation is too one-sided, and the reality, of course. And the same thing when we think about globalization and the institutions of greater openness and vulnerability that we've been building over the past 25 years. And did we recognize the test of building more intelligent social systems and welfare systems that would cope with the vulnerability and cope with the creation of winners and losers? And I think what we're realizing now is that we need to be more aggressive on that side. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I thought it was a really interesting, the ideas that you're bringing up, and I'm not sure if I've got a question or, I mean, it's about being.
That's a good comment so far.
I thought you'd let me go on.
I'm going to give you lots of rope.
It's about, you know, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist about the future. And I don't think it's about the pace of change. It's about understanding what people want. And, you know, I think it's sad because a lot of the movements that are getting traction at the moment have very simplistic messages. I mean, people are frightened, and, you know, someone comes forward and says, this is the baddie, and I can bash the baddie. And people go with that. And it's, you know, given what resources are available to us to be able to understand the arguments and the nuances, and actually the more simple the message, the more it seems to get traction in many ways, because people seem to be frightened. And it seems to me it's because technology, all this change, is not really it's taking away people's control of their own destiny. And so people, and I think that, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that it's actually trying to understand what people want. As to whether you can be optimistic or pessimistic. I mean, yes, you want a longer life. Do you want cheaper taxi rides in London and San Francisco? Yeah, it's great if you can afford a taxi, but that's not about your future, your destiny, what you can do for your family. And in the end, I think, you know, people in the United States and the Western world in particular are frightened because of this lack of control over their destiny. and whether, you know, technology could somehow give that back to them.
I think we'll take that as a comment, Ross.
Okay.
Well, maybe if I can,
because there's some other hands.
if I can give a half answer. It's a half question.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
What do people want?
that's right. And I mean, so my comment back to your comment would be you know, something along the lines of, so we've created this world where we value personal choice very highly. And the complexity of the world we live in now is a lot of the personal choices we make that that society tells us these are good choices. You know, I'm trying to do right by myself. I'm trying to do right by my family. You know, I'm trying to create a business or start a job or do my work. All of these choices we make in aggregate, collectively, sometimes have unintended bad consequences we just never intended. Right? Nobody intended climate change, but you know, I visited my godfather this weekend in Rome. I flew there. I felt that was a good thing, that we found time out of our busy lives to visit one another, just to celebrate our personal relationship. But I harmed the climate in making that choice. I didn't intend that, but it happened. So my point that I'm trying to grope towards is that it's difficult to understand sort of this tension between what personally feels right and good and what collectively has bad consequences. And so I think, you know, part of learning from history, part of buying the book and reading it, is just to recognize that this is hard work. And we need to work at it. And actually, in the Renaissance, you know, the humanist movement was very much about that. It's, you know, there are classical virtues of honesty, of audacity, of dignity that are important. And it's hard to pinpoint down why. It's not economic reason. It's not going to raise GDP. But appreciating art, for example, takes us away from our short-termism, from our economic exchange, and connects us to larger, more intangible values. And doing from that place, we can start to just recognize these complex social questions. So, you know, interesting, just last comment on this exchange of comments. So this is the 10-year anniversary of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. And 10 years ago, I was trained as one of his climate change presenters in Canada. I went around Canada and then later in China, you know, talking about it, doing the slide presentation, all of that. And you know, he's been on this for the last 10 years. It's an enormously difficult issue. And we're not even sure, I think, what we're really asking people to do. Are we asking everyone to just give up our negative impact on the climate? But at a minimum, we're asking ourselves to continue to raise the awareness, to continue to be troubled by the complexities and the challenges of our interdependency and our vulnerability, and to internalize that. Even if there's no clear answer right now, we can at least hold ourselves attentive to the difficulty and to the difficult moral choices that are just embedded in our reality now.
We're going to need a drink after this.
Yeah, sorry, is that too deep?
Let's see how many hands are up. 1, 2, 3. No one on the side? Okay. We'll take the three of you. Is there someone on the side? Okay, yeah, okay.
Well, congratulations to this wonderful book and this great presentation. It's
A friend of yours?
Yeah, it is actually. But that's beside the point. I'm sure he's being sincere.
I'm not using my Panama accounts anymore. So no, it's great that you're making Discovery great again in the spirit of this morning's talk show. And I appreciated your comment about sort of this somewhat blind approach to the benefits of globalization 20, 30 years ago. Academy, think tank world, and national organizations hyping that. If we go to today, what would you think are the top 3 dangerous ideas that are floating around in an equally unreflected way in the academy, in the think tank world, in governments, as perhaps did this undifferentiated view of globalization did 20, 30 years ago?
All right, let me give you 3, and Chris might have 3 different ones. The academies of think tank worlds, you've given us the whole universe with that, because there's some crazy academies and think tanks. I think the one really dangerous idea that's floating around is that which is behind Trump and a lot of those sorts of things, which comes out of the view that somehow countries will be stronger by being more protectionist and nationalist and xenophobic. So it's a whole package. I mean, it's another very dangerous idea is, I think, that related to basically the dominant economics ideology, which is pretty universal, of rational expectations, individual supremacy, rational choice, shaping market forces, which accounts for a lot of the discounting of externalities, whether it's climate change, antibiotic resistance, whatever. It undervalues interdependency and impact. And I think just because it's a hobby horse of mine, I think another very dangerous idea, which is rather paradoxical in a way as well, is the techno-optimism that comes out of a lot of technology companies in Silicon Valley. I've actually just spent the last 2 days at Google Zeitgeist. And
so you were popular.
No, but there was a lot of these techno people there, and basically they got an app to solve any problem in the world. And that's how a lot of people think, that these technologies are somehow progressive platforms in themselves and can solve every problem. And many books have been written about this. I think this is dangerous both because technologies are all dual use. So the same DNA sequencer that can improve all our lives could kill us if someone wants to build a new smallpox or something for Moore's law declining price. And there are many other examples of that dual use, or mobile phone blowing something up, or ISIS being the largest recruiter of foreign fighters since the Spanish Civil War using social media. These platforms are shaped by the societies that use them. And so they don't take away choice, they make the choices more powerful and more significant than we have. And we are, I think, at our peril, allowing technologies to just evolve. I'm not saying stop technologies, I'm not at all saying that. I'm saying we need to understand them and shape them and regulate their use, etc., in a more considered manner than we are.
Thank you for an interesting talk.
Okay.
You've mentioned some of the unintended consequences of inventions in the Renaissance. In particular, you mentioned the Gutenberg press. What are some of the unintended consequences that you can imagine out of the trends that you investigated in your book?
Do you want to start with that, Chris?
Unintended consequences of the trends we investigate in our book. Boy, that's...
Let me start while you think with some. I mean, one I've just mentioned, yeah.
Yeah.
One is this. We talk a lot about Moore's law and the exponential growth in computing power and where that goes, what that does to power of individuals. One is this power for the first time in human history of small groups to kill millions of people or to bring down banks and all that. That's pretty new. Barings Bank had existed for over 200 years and one kid brought it down. A 15-year-old kid in Ireland brought down UK's mobile network. ISIS hacked the Pentagon computer. That's new. And that's just the beginning of a trend of new power relationships, etc. So I think one trend is this changing relation between individuals and states and the power of individuals to create and destroy. A second trend is this tension between individual and collective and how that plays out. So we, are we going to lose all privacy? Which I think we will. Or are we going to become more individualistic and more able to shape cocoon our environments? And perhaps a third trend is this growing extremism. I think we're in for a very, very rough ride of extremism unless we act very decisively to make more people feel that the future holds something for them in the vision that we have of an open and integrated, rapidly changing world. And otherwise people will put the brakes on that very quickly, and they are. We see it in the politics globally. This is going to get worse before it gets better because we're not acting fast enough on it.
I mean, I won't give more specific examples. I think half the book is about the unintended consequences. But maybe more in a general sense, just give our framework, our language for talking about this, as we say, in the 90s and 2000s, we talked about being connected, or being hyper-connected, which just means more connected. And that this language isn't right. You know, that's not the situation that we're in. And if we want to correctly perceive it, we need to change our language. You know, we're not connected, we're tangled. We're entangled together. And entanglement is different from connectivity. You can imagine the ways. You know, it's that we're knotted. You know, when we want to disentangle ourselves, we discover that we can't. You know, the goods and bads flow through the connections that we've made with one another. There's a lack of optionality. There's also a competitiveness to the world we live in today. You know, you look at the South China Sea, for example. You look at the fight to sort of claim the Arctic seabed. There's a kind of, gee, doesn't the world sound nice when we're connected? But it's also contested. Right? So I think changing our language about connectivity is really important to help us see more clearly the unintended consequences all around us.
Right, last question.
I think your emphasis on place is interesting and important because really since 1550, if that's the date you want to choose, there has been a very strong spatial dimension to global inequality. And part perhaps of the problem of the Renaissance to the present is you miss out the intermediate period of global empires, and especially European empires, which probably fixed those inequalities to some degree. So my question is, to what extent does the new technology devolve space and devolve the place where innovation and hubs, crucibles, can happen? There is some evidence that it's taking place, and that's very exciting. China and India, you mentioned, but do you see that as a potentially strong consequence, or that the technology essentially and finance is essentially concentrating wealth by place?
Williams, was your title professor you were the Rhodes Professor of African history work, yeah? So knows a huge amount more than we do about this topic. So great to see you here. Crystal has something to say on this as well, I'm sure. The number of places where things are happening is growing, and certainly the center of gravity, and we have a chart on this, is moving to Asia. There's no evidence that I've seen that within countries there isn't concentration. And actually the World Bank's report on human geography, which was I think 3 years ago, does a lot of analysis which maps this out over time across the world in different countries. And talks about the growing returns to being in the right place, up to cities of about 10 million people, when the congestion effects, pollution effects, and others start undermining the benefits of being closer together. I'm sure for many people you'll be able to work from home in the rural bliss, but for most people in the world, being in the right place is still going to be more important, not less important, I think, in the future. And there'll be a small number of those places within it, not in the world, there'll be many hundreds of them, but within a country, especially smaller countries. In China, there'll be many. So the cities have not lost their appeal, and I think they'll become more appealing once we get through this hump, because they'll become cleaner. So one of the reasons we don't like cities is because they're terribly polluted, and actually property prices will change dramatically. You know, you wouldn't want to live near the Westway in London now, because you apart from your kids getting lead poisoning, it's too noisy and horrible. But imagine an electric vehicle world. You wouldn't hear anything, and it'd be totally clean. So living on the side of highways and in big cities will certainly become a much more pleasant experience. When we're in a post-carbon world. So I think it'll take some time, but I think that engine of attractiveness is going to grow.
I mean, just maybe briefly to add the point. So in the domain of science and technology, I think it's important to sort of distinguish between knowledge that is explicit and so sort of can be everywhere, anytime, instantly, and everybody has access to it. And knowledge that is implicit, and I think at the forefront of a lot of scientific and technological endeavor, knowing what pathways are likely to work and which ones not, who to speak to get past a certain obstacle or to obtain the resources you need. Those sets of knowings are tacit, they're implicit, and the more sort of complex and thorny the frontier becomes, I think the more rooted those things become to place. I suppose one of the reasons why the Oxford Martin School plays a very important role in the university here. And so those, not all knowledge can be sort of put on the internet and made freely and widely available. A lot of it is still in our minds, is still in our relationships with one another, is still in our intuitions. And that as well, I think, is why place plays an increasingly important role in a lot of disciplines, especially as that tacit knowledge becomes more and more hard to codify.
And the places are joined up. I mean, that's the really exciting thing. That global scholarship and global knowledge and global creation is joined up in extraordinary new ways, like it was in the Renaissance. So expect a lot more, whatever you love, expect more of it. More Einsteins and Shakespeare's and Mozart's, and whatever you love, there'll be a lot more of. And make sure that in embracing that, you look after the downsides, otherwise there'll be no more of that. It will decline due to the tensions that will rise. So that's the challenge. Now,
hopefully all of us love books.
All of us love books. Yeah, books are becoming more popular as live acts are, which is interesting as well. So it's very good for musicians who do live acts. So just 2 more big events for the Oxford Martin School this term. This Thursday, we have the culminating lecture of our lecture series this term on Thursdays at 5, which is exactly on this question of individual choice and collective outcomes. So we've funded a whole series of new research streams on this, and the different research streams talking about oceans, antibiotic resistance and viruses, energy systems, and the political economy of it. I'll be chairing a discussion amongst all of these research directors about what they haven't yet learned everything, because this is the beginning of the research process, but what have they learned so far? And a really interesting question, what are they learning from each other? What can you learn in managing the oceans from the management of vaccines and antibiotics or other systems? So that's part of what we try to do. So that's on Thursday at 5 o'clock, and then on is it the 2nd of June? 2nd of June at 5 or 5:30? 5:30 at the Sheldonian. Michael Sandel, who is really, I think, the leader in the world in thinking about the relationship between ethics and markets, will be talking at the Sheldonian at 5:30. You need to register for these events, and that one is, I guess, approaching capacity. So thanks to you all for coming. Thanks for your interest in the book and the Oxford Martin School. Chris and I will do a signing. I guess it's the only time you're going to get both of us to be in the same place at the same time to sign if you want both of us. But you don't have to have a book. Just enjoy the drinks as well. And we look forward to chatting more with you. So thanks to you all for coming.
Thank you.